Okay.
Let me stop sharing my screen for a second.
Yeah.
Sorry, I totally forgot I was still sharing it.
Okay.
Let me stop sharing my screen for a second.
Yay. Okay. I think we should start right now, and then other people can just join in whenever they're here. Yeah.
Cool. Very good. In
All right.
case, I will. Sorry, just have to organize all my windows before I get started.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. So, hi, nice to meet you all. I am Jay Tobin. I am currently in New York, where it is 9 p.m. I'm going to talk to you all today about a software that I made called polyMorph and something called generative music, which is something that is kind of beyond the Western spectrum of like pop music and stuff you'd hear in the radio, but I promise you, still something that you'd probably want to listen to. So let's get started. And I have to remember to share my screen.
Yeah. I'll translate that what you just said.
Thank you.
今天我邀请我的研究所的学长 Jay 来分享他的论文，然后他跟我一样在纽约，所以我们现在是晚上9点。然后他今天要分享的是他自己设计的，就他的论文主题，然后是一个音乐制作的软体，叫做 polyMorph。Hi Clement 。然后他的这个软体就是他今天除了分享 polyMorph 之外，也会分享就是什么是生成式音乐这样子，然后里面有很多逻辑跟传统西方的音乐有所不同，然后但是还是会很有趣，然后过程当中我们也不需要有程式的，就是程式设计的基础背景这样子，所以大家不用紧张。OK。
Very good. That is exactly what I just said. I accidentally skipped a slide. All right, very good. So today in the workshop, we are going to talk about generative music. We're going to explore the software I made, polyMorph, just a bit, get a nice glimpse of it over 30 minutes. And we will cover just a couple of techniques for making some neat sort of texture drone-based music, which is sort of a way that polyMorph works. But yeah, that's it for the slide.
我们今天会谈谈什么是生成式音乐，然后了解 polyMorph 这个软体要怎么使用。那大概会有30分钟的介绍，这样，然后我们之后就会讲更多不同的技巧，还有怎么去制造不同声音的质感，尤其是自动生成的声音质感，这样。
Very good. Okay, so generative music is something that's made using a sort of process. Like a lot of people like to use the word algorithm, which itself is kind of a loaded term, but generative music is kind of something that isn't finished. It's something that builds on itself over time and can kind of go on infinitely, sort of like a program that you could just leave on and it'll just keep going and going and going. So actually, I'm not going to show this example because I'm going to show one that I made in the next slide, but that is that for this slide.
所以什么是生成式音乐呢？它就是一种利用所谓创作步骤生成的音乐。然后有些人会说它是用演算法生成的音乐，但演算法是一个就是很大的词，所以我们可以说就是它是用创作步骤生成的。那这种音乐通常没有一个结尾，它没有完成的那个时间点，然后那个软体如果只是放着的话，声音就会一直不同的变化，然后理论上永远不会结束。那在这个投影片里面有一个范例，大家 结束之后可以再点去看，但是 Jay 现在想要分享他自己做的范例，这样。
Okay, for the next slide. Okay, so I will be pulling out of the screen share for a second and moving into making sure everything is in its right place. This, right? Yes. Okay, so I'm assuming that you can see this big mess. I've turned the audio on. So hopefully you can hear me. This is an example of generative audio. So what's actually happening here is I made a little program and I gave it a list of different keyboard notes to play. And I then sort of started, if anyone's familiar with what a metronome is in music, it's just something that keeps time. So something that ticks constantly. And this is set to trigger every probably 2 seconds. So it runs through these individual notes, always a certain amount of time, and it doesn't really repeat itself, but if you just leave it on, it can go forever. And it's sort of something that generates itself over the course of time, entirely all code-based and just kind of out of my hands.
所以 Jay 就用这个软体叫做 Max MSP， 然后写了一个演算法，就是一个步骤这样子，然后基本上它就是放了不同的好几个键盘，然后让程式去在每2秒的时候就抓一个音出来演奏，这样。那这个程式它的逻辑就只是这样子而已，然后但是它可以一辈子的演奏下去，就这个音乐没有结束的一天，就算今天 Jay 不在，这个音乐还是可以继续的演奏，这样。然后每1秒音乐都不同，因为就是声音自己生成出来的。
Now we're going to, I believe, actually move to polymorph. So I will close this.
我们现在要去看 polyMorph 这个软体。
Did I just lose my tab? That's okay. There it is. Okay. So get the screen shared properly. So this big pink thing is polyMorph, the software that I built. Built it for my MFA thesis project, where I also met Lunas. And so the general gist of it is, I'll turn it on for you so you can actually hear it just a little bit. So polyMorph itself is something that is totally based off of the concept of generative music. All of it is sort of chance-based and requires sort of thinking outside of the box of the keyboard. There are no notes here. There is very little sort of musical knowledge that you need to bring into this. A lot of it is just moving your mouse around and finding the fun sweet spots, getting to do all kinds of strange things. The program itself I made in Max MSP, which is a fun little programming language. And it's a fully modular platform, which means that you can do things like swap in different instruments in real time to do different things. And you can use live input as well. Here, I'll give you some time to translate that, so as to not bog you down too much.
Right. 所以这个软体就是 polyMorph，然后它就是 J 的 MFA 毕业论文，然后我们也是这样认识的。那整个软体就是建立在生成式音乐的概念上，就是除了用以前就是在 Max MSP 里面，它是有好多个点这样互相连接。J 把 polyMorph 变得更简单，所以它很多时候都是用滑鼠这样随机控制的，你不需要对于西方音乐有比如说键盘每个键盘代表什么音，或者是音阶和弦的知识，你就可以直接透过滑鼠操控的方式，就可以去感受那个音乐的音高或是声音的变化。这样，那它整个软体也是除了是手势控制之外，也是模组化的，所以你只要按几个键就可以互相更改这上面4个不同的模组，它们代表的乐器，然后即时产生不同的声音。这样。
Oh, something I forgot to mention was, oh, can you see this window? Maybe not.
Nah.
Sure, let me reshare. So, polyMorph comes with its own dictionary of documentation, which we are currently working on translating. So, if you ever need to know something, and if you download this, which is not sure if I mentioned it, it's totally free. If you download it and if things don't necessarily make sense and if things are just a little odd, you can come into your manual here and you can scroll around, jump around however you want. All the info on all the different things that are actually in this is all here. Most of these are actually interactive, so you can, in real time, mess around with them, pretty much like a tutorial. But yeah, the big thing that I wanted to make sure that polyMorph had was in-app documentation to make sure that anyone would be able to just open this up and use it, scroll a couple inches, and pretty much know what's going on. And that, I'll leave you with that.
所以刚刚有一个没有提到的是，就是 polyMorph 有自己的像字典一样的手册。那我们目前在跟 J 合作的时候，我们想要把整个手册跟软体都翻译成中文，让大家都可以很容易的使用。这样，那如果你下载这个软体都有任何不了解的地方，你都可以直接走进那个手册，然后它里面的教学不只像字典一样介绍每个东西的功能，同时它也是互动式的，所以你即使调整教学里面的东西，它都可以就是即时有回馈，然后让你知道这些功能是什么用处。
Okay, so what actually makes polyMorph a bit more interesting than, say, if you've ever come across things like Ableton, which are rather expensive, you almost always have to end up using a piano scroll. But in polyMorph, which I just kind of showed a little, you can actually just use your mouse to control the audio and the quality of the audio, and just messing around a bit. And just by using your mouse, you can discover all these different qualities and let them sort of move over each other. And you'll notice that if you ever don't want to spend your time clicking on something, you actually can record your own gesture doing something like this. Something simple. And you can have it play back infinitely while looping. So you can actually do that with, say, just for demonstration's sake, two of these different instruments. You can record and play back, and then you have your own generative composition in probably about 45 seconds. So I'll give you that.
所以 polyMorph 跟很多不同的音乐制作软体最不一样的，比如说 Ableton 也是一个很有名的制作软体之类的差别，就在 polyMorph 是透过手势，就用滑鼠很简单的拉动控制，所以你不需要弹键盘或者知道白键跟黑键每个代表什么音符。那你只要透过滑鼠移动，在这个盘上移动，就可以调整声音的质感跟演奏的方式。那最好的点就是你可以录制你的演奏的这个手势，然后把它记录下来，所以就像有一个人会记得你怎么演奏这个乐器一样。然后你可以让这个乐器不断的重播，那它就会好像有2个人同时在演奏不同的乐器，然后混在一起的声音。
So, picking up on the idea of gestures, I'll just get this to stop playing for a second. Polymorph, I program myself, which means that I built all these different instruments to do all kinds of different things. This is actually an older build, so there aren't as many as I would like, but, so for instance, just to show you what this is something called a sample player. It's called Tape Loop. And what it does is it just takes a sample, something like any audio that you have recorded or anything that you want to download off of the internet, you can load into something like Tape Loop. And you can create your own gestures to get it to move through it. If you've ever had experience using cassette tape, it works a lot like sort of like dragging a cassette tape between your thumbs. So this is the sampler. Sandpiper, which I just showed you, is the synthesizer, which does something very similar but very, very fast. So it just sort of makes this big sweeping texture. And the other two, audio in actually just takes external output, but if I were to do that now, it would create a feedback loop. So to spare you from doing that, I will go ahead and not do that. So yeah.
所以 J 在 polyMorph 里面放了很多不同的乐器，然后比如说其中一个乐器，现在我们听到的这个是 Sandpiper， 然后 Sandpiper 就是一个音乐的取样器，然后它会就是产生如果你在移动手势的时候，它会产生很滑顺声音质感之间的切换。那还有另一个叫做 Sample Player， 就是刚刚前面示范的那个。Do you want to try switching to Sample Player?
Sure.
Yeah, Tape Loop， 这个叫 Tape Loop。然后你可以，它是一个取样器。取样器的意思就是你可以把任何你截取到声音的片段放进来，然后利用这个手势去改变，就是用它的，然后去操控你放进这个声音里面的质感跟音高之类的。这样，那还有最后一个是 Audio In， 就是 Audio In 是一个你可以直接把你麦克风的声音或者你外接乐器的声音放进去的输入界面。那现在因为 J 现在用 Zoom 在讲话，所以他没有办法把这个麦克风的声音灌进这个 polyMorph 里面。所以你也可以唱歌，然后放进 polyMorph 里面，然后让它就是使用你的声音去。
So, I'm not actually sure if you can see my cursor, but so we have Tape Loop here at the bottom, which is just the sample player. And something that we can do is actually send the output of this sample player into the inputs of one of these 4 things right down the middle, and these are all effects. So these big squares here are all instruments. They all handle actually generating the audio. If you ever, especially, or even just with audio in, these are the things that actually make the audio come into the computer. And then an effect, as you will see, is something that you apply afterwards. So this effect is very similar to if you were to play this sound, but if it were down the hall in a very, very echoey cave. So you have this, and to demonstrate. Sounds very big. So we can do that by dragging these little circles over to the right of any module or of any instrument. And they will always be labeled, if you can hear me, always be labeled send if they're going into something. So if you want to send something into any of these four things, these little color-coded circles correspond to them. And all these effects are just usually fun little, fun little sort of creative things that you can mess around with, and you can actually send effects into each other. Okay, and I'll leave you with that.
所以在 polyMorph 里面就有4个大方块，这4个大方块分别是4种不同的乐器，可以同时演奏这样。那中间的4个小方块则是不同的音效，所以在演奏完乐器之后，你可以帮这些乐器加上不同的音效。比如说最下面那个 reverb 就是一个跟回响有关的音效，所以如果你把 reverb 开得很大的话，那你的乐器就会听起来好像在一个很大的山洞里面演奏，有很大的回音。那这其中还有好多不同的音效，中间有4种不同的音效，你也可以切换这些音效，然后去感受它怎么去改变你演奏出来乐器的声音。
So now that we have sent audio in, or audio out from one of our instruments into one of our effects, we can use these little guys on the right, the smaller gray looking ones. They have the same sort of interface as the larger audio. Like for tape loop, you can click and drag. For these, you can also click and drag. So if you wanted to control tape loop, you could click on this box, which represents one of the 4 big boxes here, and you could drag to control it. And you can continue to drag to get it to control different effects. So with this, we'll control our delay. And this is really where the generative element comes in, where you can just discover your own textures as you move through this sort of gestural space. And you can kind of get it to do whatever you'd like. You can even get it to do something entirely random just by pressing a little button on the top right. And then you have something that is totally generative and will make something totally like so random that it's actually entirely out of your control. So you can leave it to go on its own, and it'll meander. I'll leave you with that.
就在中间这几个大方块跟小方块之外，右边有一排浅灰色的方块，然后这些浅灰色的方块里面又有这些其他的小方块，然后其实当中就分别代表了左边的，就是右边的界面可以用来控制左边的界面。那 左边的很多界面跟特效，你可能需要一个一个分别调整它。那如果你想要一次调整它们很多个的时候，你就可以利用右边的浅灰色界面这样。然后所以你每次，比如说你现在 J 的画面上有2个黄色的方块被选中了，那就代表左边对应形状中的中间那2个方块，这样。然后所以你就可以同时调整这些特效跟乐器。那他刚刚甚至示范了，就是你可以在这些乐器当中加入随机值，所以除了录下他刚刚表演的手势之外，你也可以让电脑随机改变手势，然后随机演奏，所以就好像是电脑在演奏音乐，不再是你在演奏音乐。
So if you ever want to get a little bit more into the guts of polymorph, there is almost always a button called Find Controls on the top left of anything that you're looking at. So if you click it, it will actually get to share my entire window for this. So what it will do is open up a window here, which I hope that you can see. So the fine controls of any instrument or effect let you actually go in and with your mouse mess around with whatever you're hearing. So for this loop, you can actually go in and change things with your mouse if that's more of your style. And just for demonstration purposes, the way that polymorph works, as I've shown you, is a lot of dragging with your mouse. So here we have one state in polymorph in this window, and if we were to click on this and drag it just a little bit, it would be something totally different. So what actually happens in polymorph to get things changing is there are things called states. So with every instrument and with most effects in the fine controls window, there are different sort of presets that you can go between. And the way that you can move between the presets is with the little drag and drop gesture. So polymorph is a lot of fun when you get in between the little existing presets. You also can program your own, but you'll notice that here the speed is 1-1. Now the speed is different, so it's moving through states. I'll give you that.
所以，然后这一解释就是 polymorph 的核心，就是你可以看到他刚刚开的那个画面，所谓的 fine control，就是更精确的调控。那其实，在 polymorph 里面，就是把这些音乐当中复杂的取样啊，然后速度，一些每段声音的速度，然后演奏这段声音的哪个部分，然后它们的各个数值简化成简单的手势，这样子。所以你就只要用手势的方式，就可以直接调整这些数字，不需要了解每个数字的音效跟它们的意义。你只要用移动的方式去感受声音会怎么变化，跟它的质感怎么改变。
And so that pretty much covers the audio side of polymorph. If you ever want to record anything that you have made, I'll move it back to this window. So if you ever want to record anything that you've made, there is this record output button at the bottom. If you tap on it, it highlights, so it's actively recording anything that is coming out of polymorph. And if you tap it again, it gives you a prompt. I'm not actually sure if you can see this, so I'll reshare the window. So this little prompt right in the middle, it'll let you name your audio file. It'll let you place it wherever you'd like. It's very similar on Windows too. You can choose your different waveform, which is its own whole kettle of fish, and then you can save. and it will have saved absolutely everything between when you turned on the record output button and then when you turned off the record output button.
在 polyMorph 里面，如果你想要最后把你做出来的声音录起来的话，那你就按那个下面有一个 Rec Output，就是录音的按钮，按下去之后，红色就会表示是你正在录音中，然后你再点一下，它就会变灰色的，没有在录音了。然后它就会把你录的东西问你说，那你现在录到的东西你要存成什么档，存在哪里？然后这些存档的东西不会，就是它是没有压缩过的音。
So that actually pretty much covers the functionality of polymorph. I do believe. Go into recording. So that is actually essentially the end of the presentation. So I'll lower this volume. Thank everyone. Thank you all very much for having me. And of course, question and answer time. Any questions at all? I'd love to talk about this or even music or anything in general. I live and breathe music. Any questions at all, I'd love to answer. But thank you immensely for your time anyways.
然后今天就是所有的对，然后 J 的工作坊目前就到技术工作坊目前就到这里，然后所以大家可以问他关于 polymorph 或是关于音乐科技或是音乐教育有关的任何问题，这样，那你可以打在 chat 或是打中文或英文都可以，或者你也可以就是举手，我可以帮你及时翻译，这样对。大家有什么问题吗？没有问题。嗯，
Truly, anything at all.
任何问题。
那个我想问 J，就是像我们平常如果没有接触生成式音乐，那初步入门想要学习，从 Polymorph 开始学习生成式音乐，但是好像又有一种，因为第一次接触会有一种好像也不知道自己到底要做什么，或者是就完全没有头绪。那会建议用什么样？有没有那种什么样的 exercise 会比较适合入门者想要熟悉这个软体可以做的那种 exercise？就比方说，先从怎么用 loop 做一段音乐，或者是结合 control center 跟哪个地方去运用，有点难问，因为其实我也有点不太会，不知道我到底想做什么，但是就是想要去借由这个软体去熟悉生成式音乐。谢谢。
So she basically said that she was asking that as a beginner, like what would you suggest her to like start with generative music if she has no knowledge in it? And then especially if she is like she firstly encountered polymorph, what kind of exercise would you suggest her to do so then she better understand the program? For instance, maybe she should try to make a loop gesture first or something else?
Sure. The general way that I often prescribe to learn polymorph is sort of, and this might actually be particularly unhelpful, it's just sort of mess around until you make something cool. So polymorph is sort of something that thrives in like being both very pretty and also very ugly at the same time. So it exists between those two things. So the best thing that you can do to, at the very least, learn polymorph is just to mess around. Just move your mouse around. Any even like small gestures. And then an intro to generative music. That's a great question. That That has a very long answer. That actually might, I don't necessarily want to say polymorph is a good intro to generative music because it definitely is not. But there is one artist whose name is Brian Eno, and he makes a lot of, he's made a few apps for the iPhone, and they're all like, this is all screen caps on YouTube. So he's like the generative music god. If you ever want to hear a great example of generative music, you should look up anything Brian Eno's made since 1980, and he has totally perfected it. He's a very good touch point for how generative music can sound. But yeah, that was a mouthful of an answer. Sorry about that.
所以 Jay 说，就是他觉得熟悉 polymorph 最好的方法就是直接下载软体，然后开始用，就是因为它都是点击式的跟滑鼠操作式，所以你就随便点一点，然后摸一摸，你其实就可以感受到声音的变化跟质感。这样，我觉得今天工作坊其实不太适合用 Zoom 进行，但我们没有其他办法。对，因为我有在那个我们跟 Jay 之前是在英文课上认识，然后那时候我们有办现场的工作坊，他现场有很好音响的时候，那个声音听起来是完全不一样，然后声响很好。所以因为今天他用 Zoom 的方式，所以他是用电脑播出来之后再收进他的麦克风，可能音质有很多变化，有比较多杂音，然后听起来没有办法听到那么细微声音当中的变化。所以我很建议大家可以直接去下载这个软体，然后当然我们之后会再推出中文界面，但是现在大家可以先玩一玩这个软体，然后感受一下声音简单的变化跟那个就是不同的质感之间这件事情，可以知道原来其实音乐不只是钢琴琴键上这么简单的几种音符这样，而是有很多很多不同的可能。然后对，然后那个因为 Lexi 刚刚有问 Jay 说，那不谈 polymorph 的话，谈生成式音乐本身还有什么有就是更普及的学习方法或知识？讲那 Jay 推荐了一个音乐艺术家，然后但我不知道他的名字怎么拼Jay, do you want to spell the artist's name in the chat?
Absolutely.
Brian Eno, 然后他就 Jay 都说他是那个生成式音乐的大神，这样，所以如果大家对生成式音乐有更有进一步兴趣的话，也可以去看看他的名字。那他好像也有发明一些可以在手机上操作的软体，所以你不一定要下载 polymorph， 你也可以用手机就是去玩这些其他的就是可以制作生成式音乐的东西，这样对。然后there's another question. Chuan Yo asks you, what do you see is, the pleasure of playing with generative music? How is it like different? We know how is it different from like traditional music making, but what's like the like why makes you interested in like generative music other than other kinds of music?
Definitely. So I personally, and this is like a very much so an answer that is just pertaining to me. I spent at least 10 years sort of making music on a keyboard and inside of like very standard music making platforms, and something that generative music let me do, especially once I started getting comfortable making my own. Generative music just kind of takes a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the creative burden off of the composer or the musician's back. And it also lets you do a fun thing where you can, especially nowadays where you can do things with AI, you can collaborate with a computer as a creative partner. So a generative music can sort of exist as an extension of something that the composer is actually able to do into a digital world where the computer can also give its own voice to a composition, or it could even write its own entire thing. Sort of like those the GANs that generate their own images. You could do the same thing with like a generative piece of music that can exist on its own within its own right. And all you had to do was sort of give a computer a prompt. But the fun part about it, at least for me, is just that it lets you move away from the keyboard, and it kind of lets you take a seat. Even literally, you can literally just move back, pull your hands away from the computer and sort of let something go, and it will exist on its own, but also because of you. But yeah, that once again, mouthful and answer. Sorry.
No, it's fine. 所以 Jay 说他自己就是这个答案是他很个人的答案，但他自己在音乐上就是有10年的音乐经验，然后他这10年都一直是在键盘上作曲，这样，然后也使用了很多不同的音乐平台自己创作音乐。那当他就是更熟悉怎么创作音乐，然后也比较就是懂得怎么制作音乐之后，他接触到生成式音乐，然后他觉得真是一个救星，因为解除了很多他自己作为编曲家的焦虑感。那一个点是因为就是编曲家不再是自己创作，他可以跟他的工具，就他的电脑合作。比如说不一定是 AI， 比如说我们目前用到的这个软体当中就没有 AI 的部分，但可能就像跟 AI 一样，比如说现在有很多 AI 会生成图像，然后让大家下几个指令就可以生出很漂亮的图。那生成式音乐也是一样，所以只是它生成的是声音这样子，那就好像电脑有自己的意识跟自己的想要发出的音乐。那另一个有趣的点就是他觉得生成式音乐给编曲家很多的自由，就是你不再需要受限于键盘本身，那还有同时很多时候你可以像他刚刚在创作过程中有很多空档是可以停下来享受，然后聆听自己制作出来的音乐，这样子就好像把那个音乐软体放上了一个自动驾驶的状况，然后音乐软体可以自己演奏，然后你再去调整你觉得需要调整的部分，这样。Right. Someone had, this is more of a comment than like a question. She was yeah, Fan Jie was saying that it is if that polymorph, it's like remixing music live like a DJ, because it's like you can generate the music in real time and then interact with the audience or the environment. And so she wanted to listen to like more your experience as like a generative music artist and how it's like different, especially when you're interacted with like a live audience or environment.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's like DJing, but you kind of have no idea what you're going to get until you get it. It's like I'm not even sure if it's just sort of like opening up a surprise box, and if you were to be DJing, everyone in the club would also hear it at the same time. So I wouldn't necessarily advise that you use it to DJ. It might be a lot of fun, actually, even as like a tool to do that with, but it is a lot like DJing, but the song is kind of being made as you go, and you have to leverage yourself against the computer to get it to sound right, and even just to get it to like be something that's pleasant, to be something that's fun to listen to. But yeah, that's definitely a very, very good analogy.
所以 Jay 说，就是他觉得 DJ 是一个很好的，就是很好的类比，对。然后，但是 generative music 就是生成式音乐比较像是 DJ， 但是不知道因为 DJ 通常他们转盘或是 DJ 操作界面的时候，他们知道接下来声音会是什么样子。可是生成式音乐比较像你是 DJ， 但是你不知道下一步音乐会长什么样子，因为它有一点点随机性，然后有的时候是电脑去决定你的声音，这样就好像每次都是打开一个惊喜箱这样，所以他不推荐大家用这个来做 DJ， 除非你喜欢就是声音带来的惊喜。There's another question Tuanyo asked, if there are two parts to this question. One is that why did you decide, like, out of all the options, why did you decide to use the mouse to control the interface? And then, as like a composer yourself, when you switch to the mouse and switch to generative music, you still have to have like sort of an overall concept, like an overarching theme for your music when you're creating music.
Okay, absolutely. Two very good questions. So the first one about the mouse is just because polyMorph is something that went through a lot of different design iterations, and honestly, my biggest designer collaborator was my girlfriend, who told me, like, when I was making this, she's like, this is so bad, no one can use this. So I was like, okay, so I'm just gonna make something totally different. So I instead decided to use the mouse because if you're on a computer, or especially if you're on like a touch surface, it's just something that like you naturally need to know how to do if you're interacting with a digital surface, and you could do it with a mouse, or it's especially fun with the touchpad on like a laptop. But just because it also gives you a lot of room to have some fun, you could draw things in, which is always a fun thing. You never know what sound you're going to get. And also because the mouse pad is sort of something that isn't particularly precise. So you can't, and that's something I really, really was trying to hone in on with polyMorph. There's a lack of precision that makes it different as a tool. So the sort of mouse as something that you kind of know where you are, but you don't really know where you are once you're clicking, just sort of brought another level to the actual physical interaction between the person and the computer, which is always totally like floating point precision. It knows exactly where everything is at all times, but you have to introduce a little bit of sort of mystery and oddity to the actual interaction process. And then for the second half of the question, it's also a very good question. So polyMorph itself is something that I built specifically so that I could load things into it, and like so that anyone would be able to load things into it. Say if they have their own actual song that they've composed, and this would just sort of mesh it into something different. But in order to do that, you actually really need, and this is something that I found even, you really need a cohesive vision going in. So polyMorph works best, and all generative music really works best if you have a general plan. And me as a composer, you sort of start with an idea. You'll start with some sort of like a melody, or even just a sound that you heard, like running water or like a pin dropping. And you will use that sound and you will turn it into something different. But in order to really get it to where you need it to be, you also kind of need to make sure that everything is in its right place before you actually start the generative process. So it's a lot like, in order to have a good, or to get something that's satisfactory, that feels good to listen to, you kind of need to hold the computer's hand a bit and tell it where to start and set it up. And then the generative process starts when you sort of let it walk on its own. But yeah.
所以 Jay 说他觉得这两个问题都非常好。那第一个问题就是关于为什么是用滑鼠触控这件事情。他说他的 polyMorph， 因为毕竟是他的论文，他其实经过了很多代不同的设计，然后才达到最后这一代设计。他说他之前有一款设计，那时候最后之所以用滑鼠，是因为他之前做过一些比较像是传统音乐的界面的设计这样，然后结果他女朋友说这个烂死了，然后没有人想要用，然后所以他才大改他的设计，变成现在杨叉想说要设计一个跟传统音乐创作软体完全不一样的东西。那还有另一个点，主要的点就是为什么是用滑鼠，是因为他觉得这是最简单，然后学习起来最不费力的东西，因为只要会使用就是需要使用电脑的人都会需要使用滑鼠，那他觉得 当然更好玩的是，如果你有笔记型电脑，然后你有一个触控板之类的，用触控板你可以更感受到那种就是实体互动操作的感觉。那不管是用滑鼠还是触控板，它在玩这个音效的时候，它都不是很精准，不像调轴或者是调数字一样，你可以得到很精确的结果。所以你大概知道你在这个板上的哪个位置，但你有点不太知道。然后那又增加了一种那种很像实体操作音乐的那种不精确，就像实体演奏乐器一样不精确的感觉，不像电子音乐好像冷冰冰的，然后带来更多的那种的玩弄音乐之间那种神秘然后好玩的感觉。那另一个问题就是，制作生成式音乐需要有一个概念吗？需要有一个创作的概念吗？这样，然后他就说他觉得这个问题很好，但他自己当初打造 polyMorph 的一个原因也是因为他工作上需要，这样，这是他的音乐创作上需要，所以他自己创作音乐的时候都会有一个概念，可是不像制作现代音乐会有一个这么明确的概念，而是一个大致的对声音的想象，比如说流水的声音，然后针掉下来的声音，运用 polyMorph 你都可以把这些声音就是截取起来取样，然后放进这个软体里面，然后之后再操控这个声音，然后让它有不同的变化，这样。那如果你有一些对于生成式音乐，就如果你更熟悉的话，你对生成式音乐有一些概念，然后你可以把这个音乐调整更好。他刚刚表演的时候比较是随机的在创作这样，但如果你有一个明确想做的方式，你比较像是抓住电脑的手，然后跟他一起工作，然后同时在某些小时候再放着让电脑自己创作这样子，所以它是有一点拉扯的过程，而不是纯粹让电脑随机的生成音乐。这样，对。I think we have time for one more question. Chuanyo asked the last one, which is that she was asking about the interface and why is it in like four, we know it's like four instruments and four like sound effects, but why are they arranged this way and why are there four? Like, is there like a specific reason, especially tied up with like key concept in creating generative music?
Honestly, this was just personal preference. And it was something that grew out of, I'm not actually sure why I chose 4, but in every single version of polyMorph that existed before this, and it looked totally different, like very, very much so just a bunch of numbers. Everything was always in 4s. So I think it speaks to me more than it does to actually to generative music of like, I just like the number 4. But something that 4 itself actually afforded me with this interface is it makes a really good rectangle. So everything kind of has its own little space to live and breathe. And specifically, I didn't want things to be too crowded. I wanted to give a lot of room for people to use the mouse. So if I could have, I absolutely would have done more. I would have done 8. I would have done 16 if I could, but it just would have been a little bit too crowded. And then I continued the motif of 4 for the effects, just because it made sense to match the 4 instruments. So that just clicked in my head. And then the little control center on the side is also in 4, just also to thematically match the and mostly just to get the nice even lines across with the effects all in 4s. But no, I guess I just like the number 4 when it comes to composing music. Old-fashioned music, something that you learn is to really, really love the number 4. So everything is in a time signature of 4, which means like 4 beats per second, and it's headache-inducing. But if you do music long enough, 4 just kind of becomes a part of your soul, and you find yourself using 4 everywhere. Like, oh, that's weird. I shouldn't. That's a very specific use case for 4 in my music platform. It's supposed to not be traditionally music. But yeah, no, it's mostly just my own fun preference for giving some space and also making sure that people have enough of something, but not a little bit too much of something.
Because it's not arbitrary in the end. Yeah. 所以 Jay 刚刚说他其实没有什么原因为什么是4格，然后这4大格跟中间有4格，他当初因为 polymorph 经过了很多代的设计，最后达到这个结果这样。然后他说他有可能只是很爱4这个数字，那主要原本的原因只是因为这样排起来画面上就是有一个很漂亮的矩形，所以视觉上看起来很美。那同时他也希望可以塞进更多乐器，就如果同时有更多乐器演奏，声音会更丰富。所以他要希望给大家就最大的空间可以玩这个滑鼠，然后又不要就是让声音就是在饱和度上打折扣。这样当然如果可以的话，他希望可以增加8格、16格之类的。对，但目前就只有4格。这样，那右边那个 control center 为什么也只有4格，也是为了就是符合全部都是4的这个原则。那下面有4。那他刚刚开玩笑说，也许其实不是随便乱选的。他之所以喜欢4，是因为他说，因为他从小是学传统音乐长大的，然后所以传统音乐当中很爱4这个东西，所有东西都是音符要节奏上是4/4拍，然后要4分音符等等的，所以很多时候是4。但是这个软体本身就是要打破传统音乐的编曲方式，但是最后却有4，所以他刚是开玩笑的。对，反正他只是说，也可能就只是他就是很喜欢4这样。对，最后那个川佑刚刚那个不是问题，对不对？最后那一题。
你说什么？
我说最后那个不是问题，对不对？那是
啊，不是，就谢谢，因为他刚刚在划那个游标的时候，我觉得很像指挥的手，就是那个游标在动的时候，让我看到很多那个4个盘，让我想到4个漫画，或者就是好像在做音乐脚本的，就那种想象力还有轨迹的录影。那我觉得是不是这4个，我才会想到它4个是有什么特殊意义？因为他在尝试很有画面，你可以跟他讲，就是好有画面。
Wait, I'm not sure how to translate that. She was basically saying that she thinks it's interesting that it was gesture based because it reminds her of like the conductors in like the conductor with its like gesture to control all the music and the quality of the sound, the texture of the sound actually. And the idea of like 4 squares also reminds her of like in memes or in like comics, they always use just like 4 squared to compose the whole thing. So that was very interesting to her.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that like there is a bit subliminally of like me being exposed to so many 4x4 grids. I was like, that would look perfect here. But yeah, the analogy for the conductor, definitely never something I thought of, which actually is like, it makes so much sense that like, of course you're conducting everything here, but yeah, that's totally right. That's an excellent observation.
所以 Jay 说他那个之前从来没有，他觉得这个比喻很好，他从来没有想过指挥的手势这件事情，他觉得这是一个超棒的比喻，他很惊讶他之前没有想过这件事情。对，那谢谢川佑的分享。那大家还有其他问题吗？或是你觉得 polyMorph 有什么东西可以再更改进？我们跟 Jay 目前在合作，希望把它界面翻译成中文。我们也有在想说，是不是 polyMorph 可以有就是新增一些功能或可以修改功能的部分。One more question. Jiayun asks, she wants to know that like in the process of, or in your life as a music artist, there's always been like a hurdle or where you just don't have your energy or creative juice flowing for you?
The biggest hurdle for me is I'm very bad at every single instrument I've ever played. So that's the one of the big reasons why polymorph exists is because I am a very bad guitarist. So the big hurdle has always been, ever since I was a little kid, just sort of like realizing that as much as I would love to sit down and play a piano, I am so bad at it, I just cannot. So I figured, like, I'll just make a software that makes it a little bit easier on me, that kind of takes the burden off, and also that like other people don't have to listen to me try and fail to play on the piano. But yeah, a lot of that main burden is definitely like, that's the whole reason why I got into programming music and like using computers for music, just because that was finally where I realized I was actually comfortable and not just like making the best out of a situation that I couldn't necessarily control because I was never good at the chords, or like figuring out what to play and when, and always hit the wrong note. But yeah, plenty of hurdles.
Is it? I'm sure that's a lie when you said that you're like really bad at playing it.
Trust me, I'm awful.
所以 Jay 说，他觉得他在做音乐过程当中最大的卡关，也是最后带他来做生成音乐的原因，是因为他很不会演奏乐器。所以他说他小时候学了很多乐器，然后他演奏吉他跟钢琴，但他都觉得他演得烂透了。然后所以作为作曲家，这是一件很挫折的事情。那他觉得这是他就是一开始最被生成式音乐吸引的一个点。I want to ask a bonus question about that.
Sure.
Like build on top of it, because you study music in undergrad, right? In the new school.
No.
So I was wondering, how is it different? Was it different from what you expected to study as like a music major student, or is it like completely, maybe it's like better, it's like worse than what you thought it was gonna be?
So the education I actually got undergrad at the new school was entirely self-guided. So I wasn't technically part of the real music majors. So the new school especially has like an absolutely incredible jazz program where everyone who goes into it is just like the best person you've ever heard. So I was always finding myself around those people, and they were always extremely talented. And I was like, I'm not sure if I really want to do that, because that just requires so much practice, and like it's expensive because I have to buy an instrument and I have to go out and like find practice space because I can't practice in my apartment. I was like, so I like really enjoy coding. I think it's fun. So I just sort of set out and made my own sort of course catalog of all these different courses for programming, like visuals, for like things like Java, things like one of the first languages I learned was processing, and I use that every single day. So it was mostly just sort of, I had an absolutely excellent experience self-guiding myself through undergrad, just because it was everything I really wanted it to be, which was just music tech. But the option to be that real good musician was absolutely there. That just was not for me.
That's lovely, actually, that the idea of like self-guided curriculum, which also I think nicely ties into the idea of like you studying MFATT because initially, or like ultimately, it's like a self-guided program.
Yep.
我刚刚问 Jay 的问题是因为 Jay 在大学的时候跟我也是就是我们念同一个学校，这样不是他大学跟我念不同学校，但他大学就是在我们现在这个硕士班，就是 New School 念书，然后他是音乐专长毕业的，这样。那 New School 其实有一个很有名的爵士乐的系，这样爵士乐主修的系，这样。然后 Jay 说他不是那个系的，因为他说那个系里面的人都超厉害，然后超有才华，但是练习爵士乐或演奏爵士乐其实是一个很贵，然后需要很多时间的东西，这样。那他觉得他没有想要花这么多时间在精进某个乐器上面，反而他在大学的时候觉得写程式跟音乐科技都很有趣，所以他其实自己 决定他要上了很多课程，他把很多课程组在一起，然后自己创作出了像这样的概念跟结果，这样他很开心，就是他最后把这些东西拼凑起来，然后就是目前现在走到生成式音乐这条路上。这样，那我刚刚跟他说很适合我们的研究所，因为我跟 J 在念的研究所就是我们学校的那个设计与科技研究所，你可以看出我跟 J 学的东西很不一样，但我们是同个研究所的，所以我们研究所就是很开放，然后让大家自己选择要上什么课。那 J 刚刚有提到说他大学最喜欢的第一个程式语言其实就是 processing， 就是我们之前介绍过的那个软体，只是 P5.js 是它的网页版本。这样，对，川佑想要问那个改进的问题吗？
是可以吗？
Yeah, sure.
对，就是在画那个画面的时候，我有看到P5的影子，就是 SY 走的那个象限感觉啊。那但是想问说，他在跑那个数值的时候，因为他刚刚的 PPT 里面有说他想要追求音乐的质感。那假设可不可以，我们学习者有一个界面，就是比如说我现在跑。它有一个 similar， 就接近到什么那个音乐的那种指标，比如说是他刚刚跑，然后会让我们有一个说现在到哪里，这个界面目前对那个值如果出来的时候，是不是会让生手会觉得，哎，我好像想象力有趋近到某一个，当然这也是一个限制，可是会让我们知道说，在一个音乐的这个光谱里面，我现在走到哪里，就是会有一个触及点，这样会让伸手或者是要做一个背逆的反思考的时候，有一个值知道自己，因为他刚刚在跑的时候，我大概到第5分钟、10分钟的时候，我会有点对游标有点就倦怠感，就那个画面，我就会发现要一个提醒物在那里，这样感觉啦，感觉
是数值吗？这是数值？
亦或是那个。看他的界面怎么设计，因为我觉得他有他的思考方式，因为他是从手，然后愿意为我们这种生手去触及点产生乐趣这件事情，我已经觉得很有贡献。但是就我用生手的角度看说，他如果再给我一个，比如说我进入了迷雾，好，然后我觉得我现在的这个音乐创作到什么状态了，就那个东西是什么，如果有出来会继续向前走，或者是我不是要这样，我就可以一个反转，或者就有一个人的思考哈。到一个状态需要一种指引物啊，但不用多，但我觉得好像会继续玩下去的那种 maintain 的那种，因为音乐需要耐力嘛，对，还有尝试，对，
还蛮有趣的，我觉得可以跟他建议看看。川佑 said that she, oh my god, this is hard to translate. She's saying that
thank you,
because we talk about P5 in like earlier discussions of our project. And then she was saying that this idea of like a gesture based panel reminds her of like the canvas on P5, where there's like an X and Y value attached to the Cartesian coordinates. But then she was wondering, even though she loves the idea of like in precision in music, would it be more beginner friendly if she can actually see the values as if like there are some XY value attached to it on the panel? So then maybe as like a beginner, if she wants specific kind of music texture, she could always go back to that value if she knows the value.
That is a good question. I mean, it absolutely exists in the back end, but I do keep it hidden as sort of like a rabbit in a hat, just so that you can't do that.
Great.
And like, that's just because probably because of me, because if I did have like the exact polar Cartesian coordinates, I would be like obsessing over it. I'd be like, I need to go back to 300/200.1 and
right.
to sound exactly like this. And I was like, I'm going to save myself that inevitable frustration and just keep it secret from even me. But yeah, polyMorph just doesn't really get that precise. In the on the back end, it absolutely does. But when it comes to actually like knowing exactly where you are in this XY grid, the best thing that you have is opening up the fine control rear panel, which is admittedly it is tough to parse at first, but they are sort of made to be unbreakable. So you can actually save your state where you are in your little fine control thing, so that you can sort of reassign it to a different corner. So everything's movable, and you can just sort of like overwrite and save something. Like if you like one specific text, you're like, oh, that's cool, I'm going to go ahead and map that over to like this side of the square. And then like screwing around, like, oh, this is a weird thing, I think that would sound nice next to the new thing I just got, so I'll just put it right in the top middle. And you definitely can like save the cool stuff and use it for later. In like the newer version of polyMorph, which I haven't put out yet, you can actually like export and save it to your computer, so you always have it, like always there. You can load it in, sounds exactly the same every time. But in this version, it's very much so like the mystery of not knowing where you are.
Yeah, okay, great. Jay 说他觉得这个比喻很好，而且这个概念也很好，但他是有意的把这些，他说他本来有这个数字，他有意想要把这些数字藏起来，因为他觉得不管是对初学者还是老手来说，可能就是知道数字之后会很执着，认为数字跟声音之间是有一个这样的对应关系，然后有怎么样对应的关系，然后他觉得就破坏了那个就是你在玩音乐当中那种体感，跟就是滑鼠轻轻的滑过去感受声音不同的细微的这个部分。这样，那他觉得最好，如果你想知道你现在的声音听起来是什么样子，最明确的数值就是把 Fine Control 那个部分打开来，就有一个细微操作。我们刚好看到有一个它有更多界面的那个部分，然后上面有所有的数值，所以其实你可以手动调整这些数值，去给到一个更精确的结果，这样子。那他说现在这个版本他今天没有办法 demo， 是因为他之后会推出一个新的版本，然后是我们会翻译成中文的那个，然后里面有一些你可以把你现在做的事情存起来，然后存到电脑里，所以你每次打开的时候那个声音都是一样的，然后界面会直接跳到就是你存好的那个状态，这样子。所以如果你想要某种特殊的声音或特定的质感，那你可以把那个东西存在你的电脑里面。可是在现在这个版本，就今天这个版本里面还没有，所以它之后会推出新的版本。这样。Right. I think that's it. Do you want to share your Instagram and stuff?
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah.
I'm actually just going to paste it right into the chat. So I never plugged where to actually download this. So you can download polyMorph on my website, which is just my name. So if you ever look up just jtobin.com, you'll find polyMorph. So that's the download link. Once again, free Mac, Windows. My Instagram, which I really just kind of use to complain, is just that. And for any questions at all, truly anything, or if you ever just like want to talk music or like music programming, or even like anything, like I've been trying to like port things over to port polyMorph over to like P5s. Like I would love to talk about truly anything. You could reach me just by throwing an email at me. I will almost always respond. I'll absolutely do my best. But yeah, thank you so much for everyone. Thank you so much for your time. It's incredibly generous. Apologies if I kept anyone over, but Munis, you're an absolutely incredible translator. Couldn't have asked for anyone better. That was absolutely unbelievable. But thank you all so much.
所以 Jay 说你可以在他的那个网站，就他在 chat 里面放的那个网站，可以去下载 polyMorph， 然后你也可以在他的 Instagram 上面 follow 他那个 @ 是他的 Instagram 账号，上面都是他说他都用那个账号来抱怨，但你可以 follow 他这样。那如果你对 polyMorph 或是对 P5， 因为他也常常用 P5， 有任何问题你都可以直接 email 他，问他相关的问题这样子。对，那我们很感谢 Jay 今天来跟大家分享这个软体，然后 we like I think this is the end of the workshop, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you so much.
We're hoping to, like looking forward to the future collaboration of translated into Taiwanese.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh yeah, that'll be something to keep the class updated on. That's gonna be so much fun. I'm so excited about that. But yeah, no, thank you. I can't thank you enough. This was absolutely so much fun. So thank you all very much. Pleasure to meet you all. Of course, a pleasure to get to talk about my software. I love to talk about it. Thank you.
OK， 我们先跟 Jay 说拜拜，拜。
拜。
好，我们今天接下来的活动是，我本来想要请那个婷柔分享怎么使用 Share Class 的，但婷柔今天好像有事情没有办法来，所以，接下来的时间，也许我们可以讨论一下，想说可以让大家讨论一下怎么，就是一方面讨论一下试教大家的心得，这样就是大家所有人都试教完了 ，Clement 还没有试教，但 Clement 现在回来了，对的心得感想。然后另一个是我们可以讨论一下最后这个大家最后的最终成果，我们想要用什么方式呈现，这样。那我想先把大家丢进那个几个小组，就是1对1，然后讨论一下你试教的心得，跟就互相分享一下你教学的心得，这样，然后跟你觉得这个工作坊最后可以用什么样的方式呈现，我们可以脑力激荡一下。那等一下会让大家回来，然后我们最后再决定要怎么做。如果
你的直播要先关掉吗？
哦，对吼，好，我先关掉直播，对不起。